Good afternoon. I'm Veronica Reynolds, Head of Community Relations here at New City Library, and I'm here with Karen Ostertag, one of our lovely adult services librarians who also collects for our speculative fiction section, which includes horror. And you may ask why I'm here instead of Brian. It's because I read horror for fun, like a true weirdo. So I was really excited to be asked to help out with this today. I'll be co-hosting with Karen. We'll be trading off talking about new and slightly older titles, things that we think you would be interested in for this end of this spooky season. Because everyone knows you're not legally allowed to be spooky after October 31st.
That's going to be a problem because I'm going to say a word right now about supply side issues. So COVID's effect, unfortunately, continues on the publishing industry. And we've generally been seeing titles come in at least 2 weeks after their pub date, if not more than that. So anything that I show here that on the slide has a date of publication noted on the slide, those are books that haven't actually come in yet. And yes, some of them unfortunately go back to September. So I'm putting in everything that we have that's come out between like August to mid-November, much of which has come in, but some of it hasn't. So take note. So this is what's new and what we're reading, horror and spooky stories. And what I'm currently reading, The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy. Think Pride and Prejudice meets Winona Earp in a roadside picnic setting. And I'm going to give you a moment to digest that because that's quite a bit. So this is a heart-wrenching, slow burn fantasy romance with a whiff of the macabre. The two main characters, Hart is a marshal and a demigod who's possibly immortal. And his job is to patrol the border of this magical realm that abuts their real world, to keep it safe from drudges who are undead, their bodies that get taken over by freed souls. He's very, very lonely. There's not a lot to do out there. And the high point of his week is dropping off corpses of undead that he has returned to the dead state at Birdsall and Sons, the local undertaker, so that he can play with his nemesis's dog. And said nemesis is the undertaker's daughter, Mercy, who is very stressed and basically single-handedly keeping her family business afloat. And she has zero time to waste on a sullen, arrogant jerk like Hart. But when Hart, in his loneliness, decides to sit down and write a letter to a friend, just anonymous, somehow the magic of the mails puts that letter into Mercy's hands, and they start an anonymous correspondence and discover, without knowing who they're talking to, that they have a lot more in common than they might realize, which is good because they're both going to need friends to deal with what Tanry is going to throw at them next. I absolutely love this book. It's atmospherically spooky, but not particularly scary. It does have some heart-racing moments, but really the focus is on the romance in this. The other book that I'm reading right now, next slide. So the other book I'm reading right now is called Other Terrors, and it's an anthology, so a collection of stories by a lot of different writers. So this focuses on the concept of the other, people who come from a different culture, different background, different sexual preferences, belief system, skin color, everyone who's not considered part of the dominant community is other. Unfortunately, that's also what horror tends to focus on. Horror teaches us the fear of the unknown, the fear of the other. So this anthology, the editors Liaguno and Mason subverted the horror trope to take the idea of the monstrous other and use authors who come from backgrounds that are typically othered to write stories where it flips that focus, where the scary thing is often the familiar thing instead of the other. And the result is very, very unsettling. It reminds you very much that monsters aren't always who you expect them to be. And it's just, I'm about halfway through it, and it's very enjoyable reading. So, Veronica, what are you currently reading?
Oh, thanks so much for asking. So I did finish this, and honestly, I finished it a little bit ago because my secret is I have a small child in my life, which means I'm rarely in the middle of things. I'm either have read or one day will read again. But I read this last year on the recommendation of a podcast, The Taking of Jake Livingston by Ryan Douglas. It says YA, but I think the content's actually pretty heavy, and I would not recommend this for a younger teen at all. I think it's really for older teens. So Jake Livingston can see the dead, but it's not a great thing for him, and he has no control over it and no one to talk to about it. He's an extremely isolated kid. He's got this brother who's always in trouble, a single mom who's working very hard to keep them afloat after his father leaves. And he is not only one of the few black kids at his kind of posh school where he has a scholarship, he's also, as far as he knows, the only gay kid. He's not out to anybody. So he's contending with all of these things. And if that wasn't enough, one of the ghosts that starts to haunt him is the ghost of a school shooter. And we follow his story as well. And Jake has to wrestle with compassion and also survival, young love, and a bunch of other things that make his life extraordinarily stressful. But I found it not only creepy, but very compassionate. And Jake is a character you want to spend more time with. I highly recommend that. I think good for any age, frankly. Good for no age is The Hollow Places by Kingfisher. I know I saw later on in the presentation that Karen has a ranking by fear factors. This one is a definitely don't turn off the lights and don't go to sleep book. It is very short for something that impacts that strongly. There is startlingly little gore, very little blood, and it is so scary. Basically, the main character, who's just escaped me, but she's helping after a divorce. She goes to help her uncle, who has like a curiosity shop, and the uncle falls and needs to take a break at home. So she's taking care of the shop for him, and she finds a hole in the wall, which she thinks was vandalism. She patches it up, but the hole just gets bigger. So she's made friends with an eccentric barista from the cafe next door, and the two of them decide to go through this hole, which, as you can imagine, was a very bad choice on everybody's part. Highly, highly recommend. If you like to really be creeped out, Kingfisher is ideal for that. The Twisted Ones was the book that came before this. They're not related, but they're very similarly flavored. So if you like the Hollow Places, I'd recommend that one as well.
Yeah, just what's kind of funny, T. Kingfisher is a pseudonym for Ursula Vernon. Under her real name, she writes very cheery children's novels. So a little bit of the Shirley Jackson going on there. So new anthologies and collections. Next slide, please. So the reason I put these up front is that anthologies and collections, an anthology is a group of books by a group of stories by different authors. A collection is when they're all by the same author. They're a very good entry point into a genre that you may not be familiar with, or that you just kind of want to test the waters, or you either don't have the time or the courage for an entire horror novel. So these, you can read one story, you could read a bunch of stories, you can skip around. It's up to you. So the first one I have here is The Gathering Dark. This one has been on all of the horror lists this year. It is listed as a YA novel, but it's supposed to have very strong crossover appeal. I say supposed to because our copy, as you can see, is backordered, but it is available currently as an ebook on Libby, so you can check it out from there. So the subtitle, An Anthology of Folk Horror. Folk horror refers to horror that uses elements of folklore. So in this case, they're talking about urban legends, sometimes children's games like Truth or Dare. And one of the reviewers said the tales possess the vibe of a shadowy slumber party destined to keep you up all night. So it's a good introduction to horror for those that aren't as familiar with the genre, but it's also a really good writing for existing genre fans. Next slide, please. So, Man-Made by Andrea L. Rogers. This is illustrated by Jeff Edwards. Andrea Rogers is Native American, and she drew on her own background for this collection of stories. So all of the classic horror monsters are here, but she also includes creatures out of Cherokee legend, and also similar to the Other Terrors book that I discussed earlier, horrors that the Cherokee people have known for centuries. So things like the horror of empire, of intimate partner violence, of the dispossession of your land. So the stories are separate, but they all follow one extended Cherokee family through time, so across centuries, starting where they started out their homelands in Georgia in the 1830s, and then going through World War I, the Vietnam War, our present, and then even into the future. And so each one gives you a particular slice that's very well set in that period, connected to the other stories, but separate. And again, this is a young adult title, but strong crossover appeal. Next slide, please. Samantha Schweblin is probably one of the best horror writers from Latin America alive today. This title was actually published originally in 2015, but this is the first time it's been made available in English. So Schweblin has won the Booker Prize 3 times, and she says that this is the book that made her a writer. So the description, the 7 houses in these 7 stories are empty, but in her tense visionary tales, something always creeps back in. A ghost, a trespasser, a child's first encounter with the fallibility of parents. In each story, the twists and turns will unnerve and surprise. Schweblin never takes the expected path and instead digs under the skin and reveals uncomfortable truths about our sense of home, of belonging, and the fragility of our connections with others. So, as I said, she is one of the most brilliant Latin American writers going today in the horror genre. If you've never read her before, this is definitely a great place to start. Next slide, please. And now we jump across the ocean to Britain's female Stephen King. C.J. Tudor is known on this side of the pond for her novel, The Burning Girls, which was a New York Public Library recommended title. This is her debut short story collection, which Library Journal describes it as several slivers of corrosive mayhem, and C.J. Tudor at her most wicked and uninhibited. So her forte is creating realistic, credible, relatable characters in uncanny circumstances. So the chills here are going to be more subtle, but no less scary for that. Next slide, please. And best horror of the year, Ellen Datlow is the queen of horror. She has been editing collections of horror since I was in high school. And this is volume 14 of her collection of the best horror of the year. So this is the best of English language horror. And this is basically the annual anthology to end all anthologies if you are a horror reader. So if you've never read horror before and you want to start with the best, this is definitely the place to go. One reviewer described it as a catalog of terror, fear, and unpleasantness as articulated by today's most challenging and exciting writers. So if you're looking for a good introduction to the best in English language horror, this is where you go. Next slide, please. Paranormal romance. I'm basically starting you in on the easy end of things, and then we're going to move up the horror scale as we go. Paranormal romance typically focuses mostly on the romance, but it has supernatural elements. So Wishful Thinking is the debut novel of a new series from Celestine Martin. This is the Elemental Love series. And I believe all of them in the series are going to be set in the same town, which she named Freya Grove. And it's on the Jersey Shore. So it's got a little bit of local interest here. In this one, we have a stay-at-home witch who makes a wish that goes horribly wrong and leaves her unable to say no to anything. So, want to sign up for a 10K run? Yeah. Want to help your high school crush unjinx your house? Unjinx his house? No. Yeah. So unfortunately for her, the guy that she has had a crush on since high school, who moved away 10 years ago to travel the world as a travel photographer, has moved back in order to sell his family home. And there's a curse on the house, and he's asked her help to uncurse it for the sole reason of getting out of town. He just wants to sell this house and leave. And the last thing that she wants to do is let him do that. So this is charming, whimsical, and the town itself is kind of a character in its own right. So here we have another character who can see ghosts. The heroine in this story, Gemma Daniels, can see ghosts, and if she touches them, other people will be able to see them also. So on a dare, at a bachelorette night, she kisses a total stranger, Levi Walker, without realizing that he's a ghost who's been sent to help her fix an issue from her past, reunite her with her long-lost twin sister. But she's touched him, and so now everyone can see it, can see him. And the only way that they're able to explain his presence is to pretend that they're dating. So now Levi has been promised a second chance of at life if he can help Gemma reunite with his sister, but he only has 3 months to do it. And if he succeeds, he will never see her again. So now he's left with the dilemma: does he go through with it, or does he stay with her? Now we're going to move into dark fantasy. Excuse me a moment. I may have to put the mask on because I think my allergies are getting to me.
A debut novel, book page, best books of 2022. In Dean's bigotry debut, Devon was raised on princess stories, literally. She's part of a venerable clan of book eaters. Instead of food, they munch thrillers, romance, and when they misbehave, dusty dictionaries. She's terrified to learn that her son is born hungry not for paper, but human minds. Devon, who has always chafed under her family's patriarchal control, goes on the run to save her child from the family that wants to destroy him. PW says it gives the phrase voracious reader a new and very literal meaning. Leslie Penelope's The Monster We Defy. Fresh off winning a spot on Time's 100 Fantasy Books of All Time list with Song of Blood and Stone, the first of her Earthsinger chronicles written as L. Penelope, Leslie Penelope returns with The Monsters We Defy. In 1925 Washington, D.C., spirit talker Clara Johnson literally owns the spirit of her life. The Empress ruling the spirit would offer to cancel her debts if she will steal a wealthy opera singer's ring for her. Clara must assemble a ragtag crew to pull up a daring heist to save her community in a timely and dazzling historical fantasy that weaves together African American folk magic, history, and romance.
Okay, The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandana. This is another one that comes very highly recommended, and I can't wait to read this, but someone else already has it out. In a world where witches must stay apart to avoid mingling their powers and drawing attention from normal people, orphaned witch Mika is very lonely indeed, but she follows the rules with one exception. She has an online account where she posts videos pretending to be a witch. Unfortunately, there's someone who recognizes that she's not just pretending, and she receives an offer to travel to the remote and mysterious Nowhere House to teach 3 young witches how to control their magic. However, 4 witches in one household is courting disaster, and not everyone is happy to have her there. This is a magical tale about finding yourself and making a found family that will leave the reader enchanted. Pun intended. Next slide, please. So, Stephen King's fairy tale. This is unsurprisingly one of the big books of the fall. This is King's pandemic novel, meaning the thing that he wrote when the rest of us were locked away. And it's the book that he's wanted to write for the last dozen years or so, but just hasn't had the time. So note that this is in dark fantasy. It's not in horror. It's not a particularly scary book, although it definitely has scary elements to it. The main character, Charlie Reed, has a pretty horrible life, and then he takes a job as a caretaker for an old recluse who has a lovable old dog and a very unusual shed in his backyard. This is a classic boy and his dog portal fantasy, where the boy goes through the portal in the shed to discover himself in a fairyland where evil has taken hold. So if you like Stephen King, you know what you're in for with this book. Yeah, can't say much more about this one. Next slide, please. So I put these two together because this year we have not one, but 2 books featuring the legendary witch Baba Yaga or her descendants. So in the first one, The Witch and the Tsar, Baba Yaga is a half goddess, and she is reviled in public, but loved or at least respected in private. She helps her community, and she's a local healer. When the Tsarina comes to her for healing, Yaga gets pulled into a conflict for the soul of her country that brings her face to face not only with Ivan the Terrible, but the meddlesome gods who are pulling his strings. And then in Thistlefoot, the second book, this is about Baba Yaga's descendants who are now living in America and have actually separated from one another, but their inheritance brings them together. Baba Yaga's chicken-legged house finds them and brings them together, but unfortunately, is trailing a shadowy evil that has also stalked the house from the old country. Next slide. The House of Hunger. This is another one that has received a lot of buzz this fall. This is from the author of The Year of the Witching, which was a very popular horror novel last year. So the main character, Marion, was raised in the slums. She's a poor city girl, and she gains a position as a blood maid to the powerful and notorious Countess Lisavet in the House of Hunger. The two of them develop a relationship, surrounded by decadence and danger in equal measure. Marion risks her position, her budding love with Lisavet, and possibly her own life to uncover the secrets of the House of Hunger and the true role of the Blood Maids. Publishers Weekly wrote that this is a fascinating new spin on vampires that combines gory but gorgeous imagery and searing social commentary. This compulsively readable novel gives readers something to sink their teeth into. So it is definitely not for the faint of heart, because the gore level on that one is quite high, but it's also not a particularly scary book. It's just very, very bloody. Next slide, please. So I called this section horror or not, because these are things that are not classically horror. They're either thrillers that may or may not have a supernatural element, and telling you whether it did or not is kind of giving away the plot, or works of nonfiction that cover themes that are generally found in horror. So next slide, please. So this first one, We Spread by Ian Reid, is going to be particularly disturbing for anyone who's getting into their senior years and has ever considered or has ever had a loved one who's considering going into assisted living. Because that's exactly the point of horror in this book. After a bad fall, aging artist Penny, the unreliable narrator of this exquisite novel of psychological suspense, is sent to an assisted living facility that was prearranged by her longtime partner before his death. But Penny is a very independent spirit. She's an artist, and she chafes at the facility's control over her daily life. And she begins to believe that things there are not what they seem. But we, as the reader, don't know if there's actually something strange going on, or if it's Penny's own fracturing memory that's at fault. And Publishers Weekly wrote, this deep plunge into fears about growing old and losing control is unforgettable. Next slide, please. So Jackal is another debut from Haitian-American author Adams. A Black woman named Liz has returned to her predominantly white town for a wedding that's been shattered by the disappearance of the bride's daughter, one of several Black girls who have vanished recently in the town's creepy woods. Adams presents changing theories during the course of the book about the possible humans involved as Liz struggles with who to trust and navigates dreamscapes that seem increasingly real. This novel is a masterful and emotionally wrenching gem of Black storytelling. And again, supernatural thriller, which means it's up to question whether these disappearances have a supernatural source or a human source. Next slide, please. So this is another one that's backordered, and I'm kind of looking forward to it. This is an illustrated compendium of American folklore and history focusing on cryptids, which is the fancy word for local monsters. Think of the New Jersey Devil, the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot. Those are all cryptids. So this explores stories about cryptids, the stories we tell about local monsters, and what those stories say about us. This is aimed at believers and non-believers alike. The author does not shy from exposing hoaxes like jackalopes, or deliberate leveraging of cryptid enthusiasm, such as the town of Norfolk, Virginia, which buys into their local mermaids by populating the town with mermaid sculptures. Acker has lots of time for these communities and their beliefs, and his breezy storytelling talents make for enjoyable reading. So The Ruin of All Witches is another work of nonfiction. Malcolm Gaskill is the preeminent expert in witchcraft history. And with this one, he brings us a gripping story of family tragedy brought about by witch hunting in 17th century Puritan New England. A couple with 2 children and a third son who is deceased. The wife is accused of witchcraft and in turn accuses her husband, and they both get put on trial. Library Journal describes this as an intriguing, vivid, and often frightening study of witch hunts, consequent trials, and the community's psychological state and how their suspicions lead to destructive consequences. It is somewhat dense. He does go heavy on the history, but he provides a very rich background tapestry, and he is a fantastic storyteller. So if you like things that go bump in the night, but prefer to read nonfiction, this is definitely the book for you. Okay, now we get into horror proper. So I've called this one mild horror. These are things that have kind of a spooky, unsettling feel to them. The environment is definitely spooky, but you're not going to find so much in the way of jump scares here. So, Such Sharp Teeth. If you're a fan of the horror genre, you may already be familiar with Rachel Harrison, who brought us Cackle and The Return. In this one, we have a young woman who is forced to move back to her hometown. Her twin sister is pregnant and she's helping. And she herself feels like she's in need of a change. And she gets a transformation instead. She gets into a car accident, and when she gets out of the car, she gets attacked by some large animal. She manages to fight it off and survive, and then discovers that she's different. She's stronger. Her senses are sharper. And the moon is oddly fascinating to her. So she has to discover if her newfound talents are going to put her loved ones in danger, or if it's simply a new way of getting in touch with her true wild self. The author's style is gripping and will keep you reading way past your bedtime. Although it is on the gory side, so that sleep may be troubled. So Sign here is your classic comedy horror. For fans, this is another debut novel for fans of Grady Hendrix, Christopher Moore's vampire novels. One reviewer described it as The Office meets The Good Place. It is absurd, dark horror comedy and murder mystery all in one, with the two halves of the story being linked in some very twisty and intriguing ways. Our main character is the demon Peyote Trip. All of the characters have wild, whacked out names. He works in the deals department in hell, and he needs one more member of the Harrison family to sell their soul to him so he can finally get promoted. Meanwhile, the Harrison family is headed to their lake house for their summer vacation, and old memories and secrets are threatening to boil over. Nothing is as it seems, either on Earth or below. This is a wild and compelling ride, but I do have to give you a content warning for sexual depictions and gore. Some of the scenes that are set in hell can be pretty graphic because it's hell. Next slide, please. So, White Horse. This is another Native American author, and this is a spooky debut about an urban Native woman who must face her past when she discovers that the bracelet she wears is haunted by her mother's spirit, as well as another creature more sinister. It is part murder mystery, part ghost story, and classic new wave horror. The author is of Apache, Chickasaw, and Cherokee descent, and Kirkus says she paints a compelling portrait of friendship, love, and the quest for self-respect, offering a fierce and generous vision of contemporary Native American life, an engrossing modern horror story that blends the power of indigenous spiritualism with earthly terrors. Next slide, please. And now we're getting a little bit darker. Next slide, please. So, we've met T. Kingfisher before. Guess what? She has a new novel. What Moves the Dead? Technically, this has been out since July, but I included it because our copy just arrived this month. This is an updated classic, Poe's Fall of the House of Usher, with mushrooms, a really cool horse, and a character that is possibly Beatrix Potter. So our main character, Alex Easton, is a retired soldier, and they receive word that their childhood friend, Madeline Usher, is dying. They race to the ancestral home of the Ushers in the remote countryside of Ruritania and find there a nightmare of fungal growths and possessed wildlife and very strange doings surrounding a dark and pulsing lake. Their friend Madeline sleepwalks and speaks in strange voices at night, and her brother Roderick is consumed by a mysterious malady of the nerves. Aided by redoubtable British mycologist and a baffled American doctor, Alex must unravel the secret of the House of Usher before it consumes them all. Next slide, please. So this is one that was particularly recommended to me by a patron who very much enjoyed it. This is Small Angels by Lauren Owen. Haunted woods, a town full of secrets, and a jealous and vengeful ghost are not the ideal setting for a destination wedding. But unfortunately, the bride has chosen her fiancé's small English hometown as the venue for their upcoming nuptials. Sister of the groom, Kate, is wary of returning to a place that to her simply holds past tragedies and a sad first love that didn't end well. But there are local disturbing legends about the woods that surround the Small Angels Chapel, and the Gone sisters, including Kate's first love, who live at the edge of it, are caretakers of those legends. And Kate has learned that they are all too true. As the wedding draws closer and the darkness from the woods seeps into everyone's souls, Kate must appease the angry spirit in the woods and make peace with her past. Next slide, please. Leech. I'm kind of excited for this one. Tamsin Muir calls this a wonderful new entry to Gothic science fiction, impeccably clever and atmospheric. Think Wuthering Heights with worms. So this is a good case of the other not being the scariest thing in the book. A Baron's doctor has died mysteriously, and the Institute sends a replacement, this story's narrator, to find out what happened. The Institute is more than just a guild of doctors. All of its members are a hive mind, parts of an organism dedicated to keeping watch over humanity. This is a slow burn, creepy, gothic sci-fi mystery set in what Kirkus calls a post-apocalyptic world with an expansive history and innumerable creeping horrors hiding in its shadows. So the thing that you would expect to be the monster is actually the protagonist in this book, and there's something scarier than it out there. Next slide, please. Malice House. This is another one I'm looking forward to. A supernatural mystery and story within a story. The main character, Haven, is an artist who's returning to her childhood home to settle her Pulitzer Prize-winning author father's estate. She discovers an unpublished manuscript entitled Bedtime Stories for Monsters. So, in an attempt to boost her own career, she begins to illustrate the book and negotiate a book deal. But then she starts to catch glimpses of her monsters off the page. And she starts to question her father's dementia diagnosis and her own sanity. And then the bodies start piling up. Next slide, please. All right, now we're really getting into it. Sleep with the lights on horror. Next slide, please. Gallows Hill. The first time I read this description, I immediately thought of Gallo wine, and I have not been able to get that connection out of my head. The main character, Margot Hull, was sent away from her family's ancestral award-winning winery when she was a child. Now she's back to reconnect with her legacy and bury her parents. But Gallows Hill has a dark legacy buried beneath it, and her parents sent her away for a very good reason. One reader described this book as slow burn, but terrifying once you hear the bells. Next slide, please. So this is our second classic homage, with Stephen King's Carrie being remade with a burning social message. Sorry, I couldn't resist the pun. The main character is Madison. She's a quiet girl. She's biracial. Her mother is dead. And she has been bullied her entire life. Her abusive father forces her to pass as white at school. But then due to an incident that goes viral, her secret gets out, and the bullying at school only intensifies. Matters come to a head when the school tries to reclaim its reputation by holding their first ever integrated prom. And I will note that this is not historically set. This is modern set. But there's another secret that Madison's been hiding. And if you've read Carrie at this point, you can probably guess what it is. School Library Journal writes, supernatural portions of the book are explosive and riveting, while the racist, realistic parts are even more horrifying. Content warning is advised for racism, bullying, colorism, child abuse, gore and violence, police brutality, and racial slurs. There are two kinds of horror in this book. And you need to be braced to confront both of them to read this. It is a young adult title, but would definitely have very strong crossover appeal. Next slide, please. So here we have Josh Mallerman, and he's starting a new thing. This is Daphne, for fans of the classic teenage slasher flicks combined with a coming-of-age novel. Our main character, Kit, is in her last year on the girls' high school basketball team, but this may become the last year of her life as Daphne, the school urban legend, begins to stalk the team. Library Journal calls this a thought-provoking and honest conversation about anxiety wrapped around a Freddy Krueger-esque slasher. Next slide, please. Loot. So this one takes as its inspiration the idea of the fairy tithe. It gets described as Wicker Man meets Final Destination. And the author is traditionally a young adult author. This is her first adult novel. Loot is a fictional island off the coast of England where the residents experience unusual peace and prosperity. But every 7 years, 7 people die. No more, no less. Our main character is Florida-born Nina Treadway, who became a lady through her marriage to Lord Treadway, whose family has long protected the island. She thinks the day is superstitious nonsense until it begins. And when the day ends, Nina and the island of Loot will never be the same. Next slide, please. Little Eve. This is Catriona Ward, who, again, this is another master of horror. This was originally published in the UK in 2018. This is the first time that it's been made available in the US. And this is the book that Catriona Ward says made her a writer. On a remote island off the coast of Scotland, a cult is preparing its final rituals to bring about the end of the world and its rebirth. One of them is destined to inherit their god's powers, and little Eve will do anything to be that one. Then a chief inspector arrives on the island to investigate a brutal murder. What happens next is so heinous that a quarter century later, the villagers of Loyal still whisper about her. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk about new books in some popular series. So these are not ones that I would recommend picking up with the latest edition. If you haven't read the books in this series before, start at the beginning. Next slide, please. And I'm going to hand this one over to Veronica because she loves this series.
So I love these books. I don't know if they're horror. I don't know what they are. They're kind of genre defying. I would not recommend them if you are somebody who likes a straightforward story because they are told in a way that's meant to obscure what's happening a lot of the time. They're a little sci-fi, they're a little fantasy, but basically it is about Gideon. The first one's about Gideon, who is the only child aside from the leader of her planet to survive a catastrophic death, and she is locked in a battle of wills with this leader named Harrow, as you'll notice the main character of the second book. They're both teenagers. It's not YA though, and they are summoned by God to attend a meeting of the 9 planets. I'm saying a lot of space words. Very little space happens. What happens is a lot of necromancy. Each of the 9 planets has a different way of controlling the dead, which is their power base. And essentially, that's how the books move forward. So It is quite the curious series. It is not complete. There's a fourth book. They will leave you with more questions and answers. They will frustrate you. It's just what, if you're willing to be frustrated, they're really, really interesting books, and I highly recommend them.
Okay. So this one is a paranormal romance series. The first one was the X Hex, and it was absolutely delightful. This is a witchy rom-com featuring a Halloween-themed town in Georgia that was founded by and is haven to real witches. So basically, they put on being a spooky town, but there's a reality behind it that the normals do not know about. So this title features Gwyn, who's cousin to the first book's heroine, and Wells, who's another son of the founding Welsh warlock family, who the first son was in the first book. They start off as rivals in business, but need to work together to investigate the new mysterious coven in town and solve the mystery of Gwyn's fading magic. The first one was funny and a little steamy and absolutely adorable, and I expect the second one to be no different. Next slide, please. So this is book 2 of the Sisters Grimm. You absolutely, positively cannot start with book 2 in this series. This follows 4 supernatural half-sisters who were all separated at the age of 13. Their demon father sired them in order to corrupt humanity and control the world, but no one ever told them that. They find out about this just before they are set to have a trial of their powers to determine whether they're going to be able and also be willing to help their father conquer humanity. This book, Night of Demons and Saints, is set 3 years after the first book, so just after their 21st birthday. The sisters have lost the battle with their demon father, but the war continues. Goldie has a new plan. It involves human sacrifice, and Leanna is trying to talk her down. And Scarlet, the third sister, might be possessed by an evil spirit. I'm not going to talk about the fourth sister because that would involve spoilers. So, good end times. There are trigger warnings in this for miscarriage and talk of suicide. Next slide, please. This is my favorite series right now. This is the Scholomance trilogy. Book 3 has come out, The Golden Enclaves, and I am so glad because every single book in this series has ended on a massive, massive cliffhanger. So this is the first of 2 Dark Academia series that we're going to be discussing today. It follows young dark sorceress Elle as she attends a school for magically gifted youth. And if this sounds to you like Hogwarts, well, it's not. These kids graduate by making out of the school alive, and school is actively trying to kill them. By book 3, yay, Elle and the others have graduated. Except now, something's trying to destroy all of the enclaves out in the world outside the school, and Elle and the others have to go back to school to try to stop it. As I said, do not start with book 3. Start with book 1. Next slide, please. Olivia Blake's The Atlas 6 and The Atlas Paradox. So this is book 2. I believe there are more coming. The Atlas series, one reader described them as The Secret History meets The Umbrella Academy. This is the second of our Dark Academia series. In book one, we had six young magicians who were loving, hating, scheming, vying for the chance to join the world's foremost secret society. 6 were invited, 5 were initiated, 1 was eliminated. Now, the Alexandrian Society's secrets have been revealed to them, and the remaining Atlas members must pick a side. Do they wish to preserve the world as it is, or destroy it? Book 2 is, quote, guaranteed to have even more yearning, backstabbing, betrayal, and chaos. So that's the Atlas series. And that's all I have for you today. Next slide, please. Thank you for joining us.